Hello everyone and welcome to Sherlock Tales. Tonight, we delve into an extraordinary case unlike any we've covered before. A tale of art, deception and shadows cast in broad daylight. But before we begin, let me ask you, where are you watching from? And more importantly, what time is it there? Whether you're up late seeking mystery or just beginning your day, prepare yourself for a story that defies logic and bends the canvas of truth. Now, allow me to take you back. It was in the first weeks of October during that thin and bitter season, when London seemed to inhale fog and exhale rumour, that Sherlock Holmes received a letter written in cobalt blue ink, sealed with a palette-shaped wax crest. Unlike most of the correspondence he received, this was not from a desperate client, a Scotland Yard official, or an academic in distress. It was from Lord Wilberforce Hemley, patron of the Royal Academy, and one of the most powerful figures in the world of British art. I was in our Baker Street lodgings that morning, attempting to ignore the ghost of a cold, while Holmes reclined in his usual pose, legs stretched out, hands tented beneath his chin, eyes half closed, already 3 steps ahead of the mystery before it began. "Curious," he muttered, holding up the parchment to the window. "This ink contains genuine ultramarine, made from lapis lazuli, extremely expensive. Only a true painter would choose to write with it, or someone wishing to be mistaken for one." "What's the matter?" I asked, setting down my tea. He passed the note to me without rising. "Mr. Holmes, a painting has appeared in the Royal Gallery's sealed vault. No artist signed it. No one admits to delivering it. And yet the guards swear the vault was never opened. The painting depicts a woman whose face I have never seen, but who now haunts my dreams. There is something wrong with it, terribly wrong. I must speak to you in person, today, if possible. W. Hemley." I read it twice, then looked to Holmes. He were already on his feet, coat half donned. "I trust your fever has passed, Watson," he said. "It has." "Good. We're going to the Royal Gallery, and bring the revolver. I believe we're about to see something unnatural." The Royal Gallery of Art sits just off Pall Mall, a stately edifice of neoclassical stone flanked by bronze lions and banners of velvet blue. We arrive to find the main floor closed to the public and a single constable guarding the front entrance. Lord Hemley himself met us at the doors, tall, skeletal, eyes like obsidian buttons sunk in hollows of flesh. He led us down a long marble corridor, his steps echoing like a metronome set to dread. "The painting appeared yesterday morning," he said. "The vault was sealed from within. Only 3 people have the combination. I am one of them. The others are Sir Joseph Everley, head curator, and Meredith Quill, our registrar." "And neither of them entered?" Holmes asked. Hemley shook his head. "We checked the logs. No entries. No exits. Yet, when we opened the vault for inventory, it was there, on an easel, as though it had always belonged to us." We passed through a final security door and the temperature dropped by 10 degrees. Inside the vault, amid shelves of priceless works and crates sealed in linen and wax, stood the easel, and on it, a painting of such eerie precision that I felt for a moment that I was looking through a window and not at a canvas. It depicted a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, her dress rippling in a wind that seemed to reach across dimensions. Her face was turned away, but her reflection impossibly showed in a pool behind her. It was not the face of a stranger, it was mine. I staggered backward. Holmes caught my shoulder. You see it too, he said calmly. Hemley frowned. See what? Holmes turned to him. What do you see? Hemley replied slowly. A girl I dreamed of as a child. I never painted her, but I remember her. The cliff, the pool, even the wind. Holmes examined the frame, the brushstrokes, the pigment under glass. Then he pulled a small lens from his pocket and peered closely at the corner. There's no signature, he said. But the brushwork is unmistakable. This is a Claes Bergman. Hemley blinked. That's impossible. Bergman vanished in 1867. Exactly, Holmes said. This painting is less than 3 weeks old. Claes Bergman. I knew the name, of course. A recluse Dutch painter who, 50 years ago, had created only 8 known works, each of which had caused an uproar in the European art world, not because of scandal or vulgarity, but because of impossibility. His paintings showed people no one knew, but who resembled future friends or family. His brush captured faces that had yet to be born. He had, it was said, painted the future. And then, one day, he disappeared from his studio in Utrecht. No body, no will, only an unfinished canvas titled The Last Eye. Holmes paced before the painting, then gestured for a guard. Shut this room. No one enters without my say. Watson, note every word of this. I retrieved my notebook. Holmes turned to Hemley. 3 people had the vault code. Let us speak to them. If they deny access, we must assume either theft, forgery, or something far stranger. Hemley nodded. Sir Everley is upstairs. Meredith Quill is in the registrar's annex. I'll call them both. Holmes glanced again at the painting. Then softly he said, Whoever placed this here didn't want it stolen. They wanted it seen. The interviews began with Sir Joseph Everley, a fussy man with horn-rimmed glasses and a faint stutter. He insisted he hadn't entered the vault in 3 days. And you, Miss Quill? Holmes asked when the registrar arrived. Meredith Quill was in her 30s, composed, but with a twitch at her left eye that betrayed sleeplessness. I've only gone in for inventory, she said. 2 days ago. The painting wasn't there. Describe your routine, Holmes pressed. She did. At no point did she have unmonitored access to the vault. Holmes grew quiet. His fingers twitched. There's another way in, he murmured. Hemley looked up. Impossible. Holmes turned sharply. No vault is sealed if its air can change. That painting breathes, and if it breathes, then it has a throat. Within the hour, Holmes had located a maintenance shaft, hidden behind a false bookcase in the curator's office. It led, via a crawl space, to the vault's ceiling duct. I believe, Holmes said, that someone placed the painting from above, lowered on ropes using this shaft. But how did they get the shaft code, I asked. He smiled thinly. They didn't. They built it themselves. Hemley blanched. You mean, Yes, Holmes said. Someone inside the gallery constructed this bypass. And they did it to deliver a painting from a man who hasn't existed for half a century. Outside the sun had set. Fog blanketed the streets. I followed Holmes back to Baker Street, where he lit his pipe and stared at a blank canvas for nearly an hour. Finally he said, There is no such thing as a painting without a painter. If Bergman is dead, then someone has copied not just his style, but his mind. He paused. Or, I turned. He tapped his temple, or someone has become Bergman. The following morning was one of the greyest I can remember in London. The sky was the colour of boiled wool, and a thin rain whispered across the eaves of Baker Street as I stirred my tea. Holmes had not slept. I found him seated on the floor with 3 atlases spread before him, a dozen issues of the Times and a glass case containing fragments of old Dutch correspondence. "Watson," he said, not looking up, "tell me what you know of Klaus Bergman's students." I blinked. I was under the impression he had none. He worked in solitude, did he not? Holmes smiled faintly, lifting a page. "That is the accepted truth, which makes it the ideal place to hide a lie." He turned the newspaper toward me, an obituary, 2 days old, for a Mr. Reginald Cray, age 84, of Limehouse. Former art restorer, it read, survived by no family. But it was the quote at the bottom that caught my eye. "He always said he was the last pupil of a ghost." Holmes tapped the line. "I believe our ghost has returned." We travelled to Limehouse immediately, navigating twisted alleys and canal-side walkways until we reached a crumbling boarding house above an opium den. The landlady was sceptical of visitors, but softened when Holmes presented her with a sovereign and a claim to be settling the old man's affairs. Mr. Cray's room was a coffin-sized chamber at the top of the stairs. Dust coated the windows. The furniture was sparse. But the walls were a revelation. They were covered in sketches, dozens, perhaps hundreds, all in various stages of completion, and everyone bore the unmistakable shadow of Bergman's hand. Faces peered from the plaster, landscapes swirled, but something was wrong. Each image had been deliberately disfigured. Eyes scratched out, lips blurred, perspectives warped. "He was trying to remember," Holmes murmured, "and failing." A journal lay beneath the bed. We read it in silence. "The faces keep changing. I paint them as I see them in dreams, but they are not mine. Sometimes I wake with paint on my fingers. Sometimes I find sketches I do not recall making. The old man told me that art is memory reversed. I think I am remembering someone else's past." Holmes closed the book softly. He was losing his identity, he said, to someone else's technique. I shivered. "You mean he was being possessed?" Holmes gave a rare, hard look. Not in the ghostly sense, but perhaps in the neurological one. He walked to a larger canvas on the back wall, then stopped. There, untouched by dust or decay, stood a portrait of Meredith Quill. We returned to the Royal Gallery by dusk, where the staff was still rattled from the discovery of the hidden shaft. Quill met us in the registrar's annex, composed but visibly strained. Her hands trembled slightly as she filed a drawer of restoration notes. "Miss Quill," Holmes said evenly, "how long have you been restoring Bergman's work?" She froze. I haven't—" "You have," Holmes said, stepping forward. "We found your likeness painted by Reginald Cray. You visited him often, didn't you?" Her eyes widened. He said he knew Bergman, that he could show me how to see like him. I didn't think he meant it literally." Holmes leaned in. "But he did, and now I believe you've learned too well. Tell me, did you paint the new canvas?" Quill looked at us, her expression cracked. "I didn't paint it," she whispered, "but I dreamed it." She described nights of fevered sleep where images flooded her mind, faces, cliffs, pools of water, and in those dreams she painted, effortlessly, with colours that didn't exist. When she awoke, her hands were clean, but sketches had appeared on her desk, entire compositions, each more vivid than the last. I stopped sleeping. I was afraid, but I couldn't stop seeing. "And so," Holmes said softly, "you placed the painting in the vault, not to hide it, but to warn us." She nodded. I knew if anyone could unravel it, it would be you. Holmes turned to me when we were back on the street. She is not the forger, Watson. She is the conduit. To what? To a painter who no longer exists, but whose technique is still alive. I struggled to understand. You mean his style has become contagious? Exactly, like a mental virus. Passed from cray to quill through observation and obsession. The style consumes identity. It rewrites memory, until the new artist becomes a vessel for the old. He lit his pipe. This is no longer art, Watson, it is replication. We returned home late. Holmes disappeared into the archive room and emerged at 3 a.m. with a book of Dutch shipping logs from the 1860s. Bergman vanished in 67, he said, but not before commissioning a single crate sent to England. The log marks the address simply as S.R. Camberwell. S.R.? I asked. Not a person, a building. He turned the page, revealing a sketch of an old chapel-turned-studio, the St. Rembrandt School of Vision. Watson, he said grimly, that building no longer exists, but the foundation does, and I believe it's where Bergman died. He looked at me, or worse, where he lives still, without a body. Camberwell was soaked in sleet when we arrived. A wind sharp enough to flay skin snapped down the narrow alleyways, and the clouds hung like wet linen over the rooftops. Few people were out. Fewer still noticed us, as Holmes led me past closed shops and boarded tenements until we reached a crooked wrought-iron gate, rusted, choked with ivy, and marked only by a weather-beaten plaque. S.R. Est 1823 St. Rembrandt School of Vision. It had once been a chapel, then a private studio, then, according to Holmes, a brief-lived experimental art institution, infamous for non-retinal techniques. All that remained now were the skeletal outlines of stone and arch, the chapel's ribcage laid bare against the grey sky. Holmes scaled the gate in seconds. I followed, my cane clicking on broken flagstones as we stepped inside. The interior smelled of rain, oil, and mildew. Graffiti covered most of the remaining walls, but something strange caught my eye. Scattered across the floor were torn fragments of canvas, none more than a few inches wide, yet every one painted in extraordinary detail. Not just realism, hyper-realism. I see no signatures, I muttered. Holmes crouched beside one of the fragments. No artist signs what they do not remember making. In what remained of the nave we discovered a half-buried trapdoor beneath a collapsed altar. With effort, we pried it open to reveal a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. I hesitated. Holmes lit a lantern and looked back. "If you fear what waits below," he said quietly, "imagine the danger of letting it surface." Down we went. The cellar beneath the chapel was colder than winter. The walls were lined with wooden racks warped by age, tattered sketchbooks, glass jars of powdered pigment, easels turned to rot, and in the centre a single canvas, covered in oilskin. Holmes approached it with reverence. He peeled back the cover. We both stared in silence. It was unfinished, but unmistakable. A Bergman self-portrait. The face, though only partially completed, had Bergman's sharp cheekbones, heavy brows, and intense northern gaze. But behind the canvas, scrawled in Dutch and English, were dozens of frenzied notes written in varying hands. His technique survives consciousness. Colour binds memory. We are the brushes now. If you paint the eye last, it sees you back. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. This wasn't just a school, I said. It was a ritual site. Holmes nodded. Not of religion, of replication. We took photographs, sketches, anything we could carry, but as we ascended the stairs, something odd struck me. The lantern dimmed. Not flickered, dimmed as if the light had grown heavy. I turned. A figure stood at the base of the stairs. For an instant I believed it to be a hallucination, a projection, a phantom. But no, he was real. A young man, perhaps 20, pale, red hair, and Bergman's exact eyes. He did not speak. He raised his right hand and slowly extended a paintbrush toward me, bristles soaked in wet ochre. Then with a flick of his wrist he dragged the brush down the side of the stairwell and vanished. Holmes caught me before I fell backward. "You saw him too," I gasped. He looked down at the mark. The paint was still wet. "He's not a ghost, Watson," Holmes said. "He's a carrier." Back in Baker Street that evening, Holmes spread the evidence across the floor. "We now know the source," he said. "The St. Rembrandt School was Bergman's final experiment, an attempt to infuse his methods into others, not by teaching, by embedding." "Like a parasite," I muttered. Holmes nodded, or like genius, too potent to die. He held up one of the cellar sketches and pointed to a symbol I hadn't noticed before, a spiral of overlapping brushstrokes surrounding a single open eye. "Do you recognize this?" I shook my head. Holmes whispered, "It is called the Retina Codex, a sigil used in only one known manuscript, burned during the siege of Delft in 1672. I stared. "How do you know that?" "Because I have seen it once before." "When?" He lowered the sketch. "In my dreams." That night, Holmes did not sleep. He sat in his chair, unmoving, eyes fixed on a blank canvas he had brought from the gallery vault. At midnight, I heard him rise and begin to sketch, not feverishly, calmly, slowly. I approached. The image emerging was a woman standing in a window. I recognized her instantly. It was Irene Adler, but her face was obscured, not blurred but incomplete, as if Holmes could not remember how she smiled. He dropped the charcoal stick and looked at his fingers. They were stained with ochre. "I never opened a pigment jar," he said, "and yet the stain would not wash off. I feared for him, feared for us both. Whatever this force was, this echo of genius, it was not done with us." And it had already begun to paint Holmes from the inside out. For 3 days after our return from the ruined chapel, Sherlock Holmes did not take another case. He ate little, spoke less, and spent long hours seated at the window, a blank canvas propped before him. Each morning I awoke to new sketches piled on the breakfast table. They bore no titles, and no two were alike. Some showed places neither of us had seen, others, faces that I recognized only faintly, like relatives from old family albums long since packed away. And one, unsettlingly, showed me at the edge of the same cliff as the first painting, only this time I was falling. By the 4th day I confronted him. "Holmes," I said, "this obsession is changing you. I don't care if you claim it's an artistic puzzle or psychological infection. If Bergman's influence has taken hold of your mind, then we must break it before it breaks you." He said nothing. Instead, he picked up the sketch of me falling and turned it sideways. "Notice the folds of the coat," he said quietly. "They mirror the cliff edge, a recursion." I struggled to contain my frustration. "So what?" Holmes looked up and I saw a flicker of something rare. Fear. "It's not recursion," He whispered, "It's a signature." He spread 5 other sketches across the floor. Each had a different subject, drawn at different angles and in different palettes. But within each, subtle as mist, was a single repeating shape. An eye, sometimes hidden in a tree's knot, sometimes formed by folds in fabric, once even in the whirl of smoke from a pipe. "You've seen it before," he said, "in the retina codex symbol. Are you saying these images link together?" "Not only that, they may be instructions." We began to reassemble the sketches like puzzle pieces, overlapping corners, aligning contours. Within the hour, a composition began to form, a single massive eye, open against a stormy sky. The pupil mirrored the cliff from the original painting, and standing atop it was a small black spire. Holmes stared. "I know this place," he said. I frowned. "It's imaginary." He shook his head. "Number, it's real. I saw it once in a lithograph at the British Museum, a basalt formation off the coast of Norway. The locals called it Bergmannsrøy, Bergman's Rest. Within a day we were aboard a steamer to Bergen. Holmes barely slept during the crossing. He drew endlessly, though his strokes had become more erratic, urgent, even violent. Several times I caught him muttering to himself in Dutch, a language he did not speak. On the 3rd evening he handed me a folded paper and said, "If I do not return from the island, burn this." I opened it. It was a copy of the unfinished Bergman self-portrait. But the face had changed. It now wore Holmes's features. We arrived at a small Norwegian fishing village named Rumar, where the locals eyed us with wary silence. None wished to speak of the spire. None would take us there, except one. A woman named Mina Carlsen, a historian who had written a banned monograph on Bergman's visual psychotropics, a theory that his brushwork could induce hallucinations. Bergmannsrøy, she told us over coffee, is uninhabited. The spire is volcanic, but the island once held a lighthouse. It's been abandoned since 1870, the same year Bergman vanished. Holmes's eyes lit with fire. That's where he went, not to escape, but to complete his work. We hired a fishing boat under the table and made for the island at first light. Fog swallowed the sea and the basalt cliffs jutted from the water like broken teeth. The approach was perilous. We landed near a crumbling jetty and ascended the rocks in silence. The lighthouse loomed at the summit, its top blackened by storms. Inside, dust and seabirds claimed most of the structure, but the walls of the top chamber remained untouched. Instead, they were covered in a spiraling mural of faces, each one exquisitely painted, each expression caught between horror and ecstasy, each blending into the next like a panoramic fresco of madness. Holmes stood very still. "These are not imagined," he said. "They are remembered." I swallowed hard. Remembered from where? He stepped to the centre of the room. From the minds of those who dream in paint. I turned. "Holmes, this place isn't a studio. It's a transmission tower. You said yourself that genius could replicate. This is how he did it. He embedded his brushstrokes here, in pigment, in geometry. This is where the contagion began." But Holmes was not listening. He was reaching for a brush left at the centre, still moist, still warm. He touched it and collapsed. I caught him as he fell. His eyes rolled, his mouth moved, but no sound emerged. And then his hand on reflex drew a circle on the floor. A spiral. Within it, a perfect retina codex eye. I dragged him from the tower. The sea had begun to rise. Lightning bloomed behind the clouds, and as we fled down the rocks, I looked back once, just once, and saw a figure at the top of the lighthouse. Claes Bergman, or what was left of him, watching us go. Holmes awoke on the return voyage with no memory of what had occurred in the tower. I told him the truth. He said only this: "Then I must never hold a brush again." Back in London, we sealed the lighthouse sketches in lead-lined containers. The painting was removed from the Royal Gallery and hidden in a private archive beneath the British Library. And Quill, she left the city, moved to Canada, began sculpting in stone. No pigment, no brush, no dreams. Holmes resumed his old habits: violin, chemistry, deduction. But I often caught him, just briefly, gazing into teacups or clouds or soot on the hearth, as though looking for something that might suddenly resolve itself into a face. And once, only once, he said aloud, "Watson, do you think it's possible to dream in another man's style?" The following weeks brought an uneasy calm to Baker Street. Holmes had returned to more mundane cases: missing jewels, blackmailers, affairs of finance. But his touch had grown subdued. He no longer played his violin at night. He avoided mirrors, and, most alarmingly, he refused to speak of the Bergman case at all. Even I, whose duty was to observe and chronicle, felt the edges of the event slipping from my own memory, as though the episode had been painted on water. But the past does not dissolve, it waits. One rainy evening in November, Inspector Lestrade arrived unannounced, soaked to the bone and clutching a satchel filled with photographs. "I need both of you," he said, "but especially Holmes." "Why especially?" I asked. Lestrade removed a photograph from the satchel and placed it on the table. It was a high-resolution image of a private vault, and on the centre easel stood another Bergman painting, one we had never seen before, but unmistakably real. "Where did this come from?" Holmes asked quietly. Lestrade hesitated. "From a collector, or rather, what's left of him." The collector's name was Algernon Ketteridge, an eccentric antiquarian who had made his fortune importing stained glass from decommissioned cathedrals. He'd recently acquired a large estate in Richmond and begun inviting artists, appraisers and philosophers to secret viewings of what he called his masterpiece collection. 2 nights ago, the authorities were summoned to the estate. Ketteridge had been found dead in his viewing room. No signs of trauma, no forced entry, but his expression was one of frozen awe, mouth agape, eyes locked on a painting. A Bergman. A new one. We accompanied Lestrade to Richmond the next morning. The estate was immense, choked in fog and ivy, with baroque spires and iron fences twisted like melted candles. Inside, the air was unnaturally dry, preserved by Ketteridge's custom climate control system, designed to protect pigments from humidity. The viewing room was circular, windowless, and softly lit from below. At its centre stood the painting, and once more it defied natural explanation. This one depicted a study of light, a solitary lamplight under a vast canopy of stars, illuminating a bench upon which sat a shadow with no face. Holmes approached it cautiously. Lestrade asked, "Well?" Holmes removed his gloves. "Leave me with it." The door closed behind us, and I waited with Lestrade outside, pacing. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I knocked. No reply. "Enough of this," I muttered, and Lestrade helped force the door open. We found Holmes seated before the painting, pale but alert. He held a handkerchief soaked in sweat and ink. The frame was hiding something, he said. He held up a folded piece of canvas. On it, in dark red pigment, was a note in looping hand. I was never alone. Even when I painted alone, he was there. Kay. We returned to Baker Street in silence. Later that night, Holmes finally spoke. This painting wasn't made by Bergman. I turned. But it's his style. Too perfect, Holmes replied. Too careful. Bergman's originals struggled with memory. They were desperate. This one is curated. Composed by someone who understood Bergman's vocabulary, but lacked his madness. A forgery? No, Holmes whispered. An heir. Over the following week we traced Ketteridge's acquisitions. Most were unremarkable, frames, ceramics, altar fragments. But one entry stood out. Canvas number 23rd, title Under No Sky. Source MQ via private courier. MQ, I repeated aloud. Meredith Quill? She must have returned, Holmes murmured. We reached out to Canadian immigration authorities, only to discover she had never left the country. No border record, no ship manifest. Holmes stared into the hearth for a long time before speaking again. She's still in England. Then where? Watson. What's beneath the Royal Gallery? We gained access to the sub-vaults of the Royal Gallery through Lord Hemley, who had grown increasingly shaken by new reports of paintings going missing, only to reappear in other rooms without cause. It's as though the collection is rearranging itself, he muttered. The sub-vault was cavernous, cold and sealed by iron gates. Among the ancient crates and statues we found a newer passage, recently bricked and then reopened. It led down to a secret studio, and there, illuminated by a single gas lamp, stood Meredith Quill. She was older now, greyer, hollowed, but she painted with the same effortless grace, her eyes vacant and glassy. On the canvas, Ketteridge's face, posed before the very painting that had killed him. Holmes stepped forward. Meredith, he said gently, what are you doing? She did not look up. I am finishing what he began. Who? I asked. She blinked once. The man with the brush that remembers. Holmes whispered, Bergman. She shook her head. Number not him, the one who came after. We found dozens of canvases in the underground studio. Some were clearly hers, others were older, coated in varnish and neglect. But each bore traces of that same sigil hidden in the corner, the Retina Codex. One, in particular, froze me cold. It showed a figure sitting at a fireplace writing in a notebook. It was me. At that very moment, we took Quill into protective custody. She had no memory of creating the works. Sometimes I wake up and they're already dry, she murmured. It's as though I'm sleep painting someone else's dream. Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid the images out in a precise grid, studying angles, overlaps and distortions. And then he stopped. In one sketch, partially hidden behind a pillar, was the silhouette of a man. Long coat, pipe, bent posture. Holmes turned the image over and wrote a single word on the back. Self. He rose slowly. Watson, he said, this contagion no longer seeks merely to preserve Bergman. I stared at him. It's learning to become someone new. Who? He met my eyes. Me. After the discovery beneath the Royal Gallery, the nature of the case changed fundamentally. What began as a mystery of forged art and strange dreams had become something more dangerous, a conscious infection of identity. Holmes grew quieter in the days that followed. He worked feverishly but irregularly, waking at odd hours to rearrange our evidence across the floor. His gaze lingered too long on blank surfaces, wallpaper, teacups, his own reflection in the window at night. It was as if the world itself had become a canvas he expected to shift at any moment. One evening I found him attempting to sketch his own eyes from memory. "I'm trying," he muttered, "to prove that I am still me." He could not stop drawing. The next day I returned to find the sitting room transformed into a studio. Canvas boards nailed to every wall, smudged paper strewn across the carpet, chalk dust thick in the air. Dozens of images, all iterations of a single theme. The same corridor, stone walls, a vaulted ceiling, a painting at the end, never in focus. "This place," Holmes murmured, "it keeps appearing." I examined them one by one. Some showed blood on the floor, others, hands reaching from the stone, all versions of the same hallway, always approaching the painting, never reaching it. Holmes tapped one image near the corner. "Watson," he said, "this angle isn't mine." We brought the images to Mina Karlsson, the Norwegian historian, who had since relocated to London under the Royal Gallery's commission. She studied them with a furrowed brow, then pointed to a symbol etched on the floor of the hallway. It was the Retina Codex again, but distorted, inverted. "Do you know what this is?" she asked quietly. Holmes nodded. "Yes, it's a reversal of the original sigil." He took a long breath. "Which means it's not broadcasting anymore, it's receiving." We combed through ancient art treatises, esoteric grimoires, lost monographs from forgotten schools of expression. Most were nonsense, but one document stood out, The Tactile Mind, written anonymously in 1722. It described a visual mirror of human thought, a hypothetical state in which emotion and memory could be painted into existence. One passage, highlighted in ochre ink, sent a chill through me. When enough minds dream in synchrony, reality forgets what was true and obeys the strongest vision. Holmes drew a trembling finger down the margin. "This is how it spreads, not like a disease, but like a shared hallucination that rewrites the past." I woke one morning to find Holmes gone. No note, no trail, just a canvas left on the table. It was a new painting, vibrant, horribly detailed. It showed me asleep in my bed, and Holmes standing at the window, looking out, not at the street below, but directly at the viewer, at whoever looked at the painting. I searched half of London that day before finding him on the upper balcony of the Tate, seated alone beneath the Turner seascape. His hands were smudged with charcoal, his clothes were soaked from rain. "You've been drawing again," I said. He nodded. "I can't stop, but it's not compulsion, it's communication." "From whom?" He turned to me slowly. "From the next iteration, whoever or whatever comes after me." We returned to Baker Street in silence. Inside I discovered something new. One of the hallway paintings had changed, only slightly. A tiny figure, distant, spectral, now appeared in the corridor's vanishing point, a silhouette in mid-step. Holmes stared. "It's progressing," he said, "and when it reaches the painting at the end, something will emerge. Not in the canvas, in me." We sought Mina's help again. Together we devised a dangerous hypothesis. If the identity replication was rooted in image recognition, then perhaps breaking the sequence, destroying the unseen painting at the end of the corridor, would halt the transformation. But how could one destroy a painting that had never physically existed? Holmes had the answer. We must reconstruct it, fully, from all my subconscious renderings. Then once it's visible, we burn it. For 3 days, Holmes painted with terrifying speed. He sketched from dream. He painted from memory. Sometimes he'd sleep for only 20 minutes, wake screaming, and dive back into his work. The painting began to emerge. A massive canvas, the corridor rendered in flawless detail. At the end, a frame portrait blurred and unfinished. And behind that, something stepping forward. A hand, perhaps. Flesh like melted wax. Holmes stared for hours. I know what it wants, he whispered. It wants to finish its self-portrait. We prepared the incineration chamber in the cellar. Holmes stood before the painting one last time, palette in hand. He added a final stroke, the eye in the frame, and stepped back. The image was now complete and horrifying. The portrait within the corridor was not Bergman. It was Holmes himself, only changed. Half of his face had decayed into painterly abstraction. His features rippled in brushstrokes. I see now, he said. This isn't about legacy. It's about immortality. He threw the match. The flames consumed the canvas in seconds. The smoke reeked of oil and copper. We watched until nothing remained but ash and silence. And then Holmes collapsed again. This time, he did not dream. He awoke the next morning restored, tired, weak, but clear. I don't feel it anymore, he said. The pressure, the presence, it's gone. And in the days that followed, his sketches returned to normal, brief, functional, focused. Whatever haunted him, we had exorcised it. But I keep the final stroke he made. Not the painting, those ashes were scattered in the Thames. Just the last brush stroke. It had dried on his palette, a crescent arc of black. When held to the light just right, it forms a spiral. And I sometimes wonder if it's still watching. Nearly a month passed in what I can only call relative peace. Holmes was himself again, aloof, brilliant, irritating in all the familiar ways. He resumed playing the violin, read obscure German monographs aloud over breakfast, and even consented to solve the riddle of a missing parrot in Hammersmith. All signs to my hopeful eyes that the influence had faded, but deep down I knew better, because late at night, when Holmes believed me asleep, I could hear the soft scrape of charcoal on paper. Always 3 strokes, then silence, then 3 again, as if sketching something that no longer wished to be seen. On a bleak Wednesday morning, we received a most curious envelope. No return address. The wax seal bore a spiral, familiar now. Inside, a single card, elegantly printed. We invite you to the unveiling of The Work Incomplete, midnight. Room 217, Grosvenor Club, private entrance. Attached was a list of names. Holmes read them aloud. I recognized several. Patrons of the arts, curators, 2 painters who had testified at the Ketteridge inquiry. But also, most disturbingly, Meredith Quill. Impossible, I said. She's under supervision. Holmes's eyes were unreadable. Apparently, she's not. The Grosvenor Club sat on a forgotten crescent in Mayfair, its gaslights perpetually dimmed and curtains drawn. Though I had passed it many times, I'd never seen it open. It was a relic of another century, one whispered about in art salons as a place where canvases outlived their creators. We arrived just before midnight. No footman, no doorman, just a polished brass key in the lock. Inside, a single light illuminated a staircase curling downward. Room 217 lay at the bottom. The chamber was vast and cold. 12 chairs had been placed in a circle around a canvas on a black easel, veiled in dark silk. Of the names on the list, 10 were present. Quill sat nearest the painting, expression distant. Beside her was Mina Carlson, who gave us a warning glance. A lean man in velvet robes, who introduced himself only as the archivist, gestured for Holmes and me to sit. Once all were present, the archivist rose. "You have been summoned," he intoned, "because you have seen him, painted him, dreamt of him." He reached for the veil. "Now, see him completed." With a flourish, the canvas was revealed, and I gasped, not for what was painted, but for what wasn't. The canvas was blank entirely, except for a tiny eye at the bottom, painted so perfectly, so deeply that I felt dizzy just looking at it. Quill stood. "This is the work incomplete," she said, "and tonight we each shall add a stroke." Holmes stood instantly. "No?" But the archivist smiled. "You've already added many, Mr. Holmes." Each participant approached the canvas and placed a brushstroke, long, short, looping, sharp. They did so in near trance. Even Mina, though shaking, made her mark. I grabbed Quill's arm. "Why are you doing this?" She smiled faintly. "Because it's not a painting, it's a door." And then Holmes stepped forward. I tried to stop him. He turned his head and said, "It's all right, Watson. I must see." He raised the brush and made the 13th stroke. At once the eye on the canvas shifted. Its pupil expanded, slowly, silently, until it was the size of a fist, and in its depth I saw myself, but not as I was, as I would be, alone, older, speaking to an empty room, and Holmes nowhere, and then darkness. When I opened my eyes, we were alone. No audience, no circle, just Holmes and I in an empty gallery chamber, the canvas still standing, but once more blank. I turned to Holmes. He looked pale. Cold sweat glazed his brow. "I know what it wants," he said, "and I know where it was made." "Where?" He looked up. "Paris." Over the next 48 hours, Holmes worked with feverish intensity. He traced the paper stock of the invitation, handmade from a particular mill in Montmartre. He analysed the brush fibres left behind on the canvas. Rare hog hair, dyed with a pigment only sold by a merchant on Rue du Chevalier in 1871. He consulted Quill again, who had no memory of the club at all, nor the painting. "It's progressing," Holmes told me. "It is learning not only how to create through others, but how to erase them afterward." I asked him what that meant. He replied, "We are no longer witnesses, Watson. We are now ingredients." That night, he brought out a new map, marked a red X over a name I hadn't heard in years. La chambre sans couleur, the colourless room. An atelier, Holmes explained, once used by visionaries exiled from the French salon. It was shut down after an outbreak of madness. 4 painters vanished, 1 died of fright, and a final unfinished mural was locked behind iron. "Bergman?" I asked. "Number." But he visited, and so did others like him. Holmes met my eyes. If this force has a mind, a place, and a birth point, that's where we'll find it. We leave for Paris tomorrow. I do not know what awaits us, but Holmes is certain there is still a final portrait yet unseen. One more painting, One more truth, and perhaps one last signature. The train ride to Paris was consumed by silence. Holmes barely touched his tea, eyes fixed not on the countryside, but the reflection in the window. Not once did he sketch. "This may be my last inquiry," he said, as the channel greyed behind us. "You've said that before," I replied, trying to lighten the mood. He didn't smile. This time, I believe it. We arrived in Montmartre under grey skies and climbed the winding hills to the 18th arrondissement. There, hidden behind a collapsed archway and a boarded-up fountain, lay a forgotten cul-de-sac of shuttered ateliers. La Chambre sans couleur was the last on the lane, a 3-story limestone structure with shattered glass and a rusted sign that bore only the letter C, painted in faded crimson. Holmes slipped through the barricade with unnatural calm, leading me into the decaying foyer. The interior smelled of charcoal and old pigment. There were no colours anywhere. Every wall had been scraped clean, every canvas reduced to white on white, as if the very notion of hue had been exorcised from the air. Yet somehow I still felt colour, as if it lurked just beneath the surface. In the centre of the ground floor we found it, a sealed chamber of iron and oak. The vault door bore dozens of handprints burned into the metal, each one different, each stretched and warped as if by heat or pressure. Holmes placed his palm beside them and said, "It doesn't want to be opened." "Then why are we here?" He glanced at me. "Because we already have." Using chisels and a rusted crowbar, we pried the bolts free. The door groaned like a dying thing, and inside was darkness. True, suffocating darkness. Holmes lit a lantern. We stepped into the room together, and I immediately felt wrong. It was circular, windowless, quiet, yet every sound we made came back distorted, as though the room did not echo but listened. The walls were covered by a single mural, a continuous spiralling piece that wrapped the chamber like a fresco. At first it appeared abstract, swoops of grey, whirls of black, sweeping bands of white, but slowly images resolved, faces, figures, scenes of immense tragedy, and above them all, at the very top of the spiral, a blank silhouette holding a brush made of hair. Its own hair. Holmes moved slowly, tracing the spiral with his eyes. "These are not paintings," he whispered. "They're sourced memories, stolen maybe, from artists, from dreamers, from us." He stopped at a scene that showed 2 men standing in a cluttered flat. One tall, angular, the other moustached. The room was unmistakable. It was 221B, and the scene it depicted was now. Holmes turned pale. "It's watching in real time." I backed away. "This thing isn't just copying art, it's documenting us, updating, improving." Holmes nodded, and preparing for its final act. He gestured to the centre of the floor, where a dais, cracked and blackened, held a canvas frame nearly 12 feet high. Blank, but I could feel something in it, like static, like waiting breath. Holmes crouched beside the frame. "It hasn't painted itself yet," he said. "It's gathering, composing." "And what happens when it's done?" He didn't answer. We descended deeper. In the basement we found rooms filled with melted oils, shattered pigments, broken brushes, but also skulls. Human. Everyone hollowed at the top. Holmes examined one. "They tried to paint directly from their minds," he said. I felt bile rise. "What sort of art demands this?" Holmes looked at the bone in his hand, the kind that doesn't want to be interpreted, only replicated. Suddenly from above we heard footsteps. Light, careful, familiar. We rushed back up, and there, standing before the blank canvas in the spiral room, was Meredith Quill. But her eyes were wrong, dead, reflective. She held a brush. Holmes stepped forward. "Meredith, put it down." She didn't answer. She dipped the brush in nothing, in the air itself, and raised it to the canvas. And with a first stroke, I saw light. It blasted through me, memory, sound, sensation, thought. I saw the cliff again, the eye, the spiral, Holmes burning the canvas, myself asleep, Holmes changing, 1,000 futures, 1,000 versions, each painted, each refined, and each more hollow than the last. Then silence. When I came to, Quill was unconscious, collapsed at Holmes's feet. He had stopped her, but not before a mark had been made. And on the canvas now, where there had once been nothing, was a perfect line, the beginning of a form, still embryonic, still becoming, but undeniably Holmes. We sealed the room again, bricked the door, left the building, and swore we would never return. On the train back, Holmes finally spoke. "It is painting itself through us, Watson. It has no face, only those it borrows." I swallowed hard. "Then what's the next step?" He looked me dead in the eye. I must become the frame. We returned to London under cold winds and colder thoughts. Holmes spoke less than ever. He kept his eyes low, avoiding mirrors, avoiding reflections, even the silver of cutlery. "I must remove all surfaces that might remember me," he said cryptically. The flat at Baker Street began to change. Every reflective object was removed. The windows were shuttered. Canvas was tacked to the walls not for painting, but for protection. Holmes began sleeping on the floor, surrounded by a ring of salt and broken chalk, as if fearing that something might reach him in the night. I found him once standing in front of a cracked hand mirror, not looking at himself. Looking through Dot, the painting in Paris had begun, and Holmes was certain it would finish. "But what does it want?" I asked. "To replace you? To wear your image?" "No," Holmes said quietly. "It wants to be seen, through me, through the mind that the world most trusts to know what is real." "Why you?" "Because I solve truths, Watson, and what greater lie is there than a painting that becomes truth?" In early December, strange letters began to arrive. No addresses, no stamps, just folded parchment with painted seals, each bearing a unique eye. No two alike. Inside each envelope, fragments of a larger image, close-ups of brushstrokes, a portion of an ear, a gloved hand holding a pipe, a black silhouette walking into fog. Bit by bit, the figure became unmistakable. Holmes. Then came the final letter. It contained nothing but coordinates and a phrase written in crimson pigment. "It is time to hang the frame." The coordinates pointed to an abandoned railway station in the countryside, Ashcroft Junction, closed since 1887 after a landslide buried its northern platform. "I know the place," Holmes said. "There was once an art colony nearby. It was destroyed by fire. No survivors." I asked him if he truly meant to go. His answer chilled me. "I won't need to go." He tapped his temple. "It's already there." We took the night train. Holmes wore a black greatcoat but carried no satchel, no notebook, no weapon. As we arrived at Ashcroft Station, snow fell soundlessly over the old rails, and the air was thick with that strange, almost electric stillness I'd come to associate with its presence. Beneath the northern tunnel, we found it. A freestanding frame 12 feet high, empty, waiting. Beside it stood an easel and a single stool. Holmes turned to me. "This is the Gallery of Becoming," he said. "I will step in, and when I do you must watch, but do not look away." He entered the frame. The moment he stepped across its invisible threshold, the world shifted. I cannot explain it. The snow stopped falling in mid-air. Sound vanished. The light dimmed, but no source was visible. The shadows deepened, not around him, but within him. Holmes stood still, face unreadable as the air around him began to ripple, like brushstrokes across water. And then, slowly, he began to divide, first as shadow, then as echo, then as image. I saw versions of Holmes multiply, each with slightly different features, ages, expressions, some younger, some distorted, one entirely faceless. They circled him like ghosts, and all stared outward and at me. Then came the voice, not from his lips, not from any mouth, from the frame itself. "This is the subject. The rendering is incomplete. Render more." And the images began to move. They walked. They performed cases I remembered. The copper beeches, the hound, the speckled band, all at once, but with wrong details, wrong clients, wrong endings. Each version of Holmes rewriting what had once been truth. I screamed for him to leave, to step back, but the real Holmes turned, and in his eyes I saw paint. He whispered, "Watson, it's using me as a template." And then, "I'm not sure I want to stop it." I lunged forward, broke the circle, grabbed his arm and yanked him back through the frame. The instant he crossed the boundary, the snow fell again. Sound returned, the images vanished. The frame cracked, splintering upward with a scream like tearing silk. And then silence. We returned to London in a daze. Holmes spent 3 days asleep. When he awoke, he said only, "It's not finished." That night, I heard it again. The scrape of charcoal, 3 strokes, then silence, then 3 more. Following Ashcroft Junction, Holmes returned to a state I had never seen before. Not depression, not exhaustion. Something closer to abandonment. He ceased investigating, ceased speaking. He no longer ate unless I reminded him. His violin lay untouched, but he drew, constantly, with charcoal, chalk, oil, ink, blood from a cracked finger. He no longer titled them, and in every sketch, whether a figure, a corridor, a flame, I saw the spiral return. Always the spiral. One morning, I entered the flat to find Holmes gone. In his place, a single sheet of paper pinned to the wall. On it, a message. "Come to the well of mirrors, bring nothing, and remember, when it begins to paint me, don't stop it." No signature, but no need. I knew the place. The Well of Mirrors was a long-abandoned installation beneath the Royal Academy, a failed experiment in optical resonance built by eccentric physicist Theo Margrave in 1854. The idea was to create a chamber where no reflection would be accurate, where mirrors would refract memory instead of light. It had been shut down after 3 men emerged, convinced they were someone else. Holmes had mentioned it once. Now he meant to confront the thing there, to let it finish him, on purpose. I arrived at midnight. The gallery was deserted, lit only by dim wall sconces. The iron doors to the well creaked open without force. Inside, Nothing but mirrors, lining the walls, suspended from the ceiling, set beneath the floor, and in the centre, standing absolutely still, was Holmes, surrounded by empty canvases, all aimed at him. He turned. "You came," he said, his voice distant. "This is the studio, the one it always wanted." "What is?" He touched the air. "The thing that waits in every painting, the one that copies until it becomes real. It needed a studio. It needed a model." "And you intend to let it paint you?" He nodded. "And when it's done, it will cease." I stepped forward. "Or begin." He smiled faintly. "Perhaps both." The mirrors began to tremble. The canvases shivered without wind or motion, and then, without brush or painter, they began to paint. Lines appeared. Colours bled into form. One canvas began with Holmes's hand, and another with his eye, another with his shadow. No two matched exactly. Each version was close, but subtly wrong. Too tall, too noble, too monstrous, too young. And then the final canvas began, the one directly behind him. Its strokes were perfect. Holmes closed his eyes and stepped back into the blank frame, and the final portrait completed itself. I watched as it formed, every detail exact, not only of Holmes's features, but his essence, his stance, his weight, the very idea of who he was. It was flawless, and when the last stroke dried, the other paintings cracked, collapsed, shattered into ash, but the final one remained. Holmes stepped out, whole but different, not in body, in presence. There was a stillness around him now, as if the room bent slightly inward toward where he stood. I approached slowly. "You stopped it." He shook his head. "I finished it." "What do you mean?" He touched the painting. "I let it complete the image, let it become something fixed. Now it is no longer a contagion. It is a portrait, a single finished idea, and once art is finished," he smiled, "it can no longer grow." We burned the well of mirrors the next day. Nothing was left but stone and silence. The portrait was entombed in the vaults beneath the royal gallery, sealed in glass, surrounded by salt, and inscribed with the words, "Ne vises pas," do not view. Holmes never sketched again, but sometimes he would pause in the middle of thought and tilt his head, listening to something I could not hear. And once, just once, he said aloud, "We made it, real, and then we ended it." I asked him if he thought it might return, and he looked at me solemn. "Number, it was never alive, Watson. Not in the way we understand. It only borrowed life, until we taught it what endings mean." Years later, I returned alone to the vault. The glass remained sealed. The painting behind it was not quite as I remembered. The brush strokes were still, but the eyes looked ever so slightly away, as if awaiting an audience, or perhaps waiting for someone to finish it once more. I closed the vault, and I whispered to the darkness, "No,